Hello there, welcome to the first on this channel anyway of the Nerd Talks Films podcasts. And with this one, as it is the first on this channel, this is to rehash what I announced a while back. Nerd World Films was its own channel, a spin-off from this one, Nerd World Empire. I've combined the two thanks to the changes in the algorithm and setup on YouTube now. And this is an extension of the kind of content I used to produce just for Nerd World Films, but I want to bring it all together. This is a relaxed discussion, mostly by me sharing thoughts and passion that I have for movies as well as television. Mostly science fiction, because I'm a big science fiction buff, as you might be able to tell. This one specifically is on Terminators, and we're not just talking the movies. We're actually mostly talking the actual anthropomorphic machines themselves, the android killing machines known as the Terminators, or mostly android anyway. We're going to count them down, go over them, say why they're all awesome from the different movies, and maybe why there's some not so awesome ones, and round it off at the end. Hopefully I won't ramble too much, but try and stay with us here. We're going to do this in order of construction, not release. So to clarify that, the first movie, that was the T-800. We're actually going to start with the T-1 that is from the third movie. So also I'm not including expanded universe because this is films. I'm not doing all the comics like the T-1 million and that kind of insane madness that comes out in those comics, time traveling insanity, well, more time traveling insanity that's already in the movies. So we're going to talk about the T-1. What was the T-1? The T-1 was actually developed by the US military as a type of new form of defense platform. It had the basic appearance, at least in its face. You could sort of see the beginnings of the Terminators, the red eye, all that kind of stuff. It had no appendages like the later generation Terminators. In other words, it didn't have opposable thumbs and couldn't use human weaponry directly. It required a maintenance crew. It moved around on a set of 3 tracks. One at the rear, which wasn't as noticeable in the movie, but it did have it. It had its 2 main tracks on either side and then a little one at the back. It had 2 Gatling gun, well, miniguns as you would call them, mounted on the arms, which, you know, is so Terminator in general. These machines were generally considered rather dumb, but they were the first phase of Terminators created. They were more or less remote operated, not really left to their own devices. But they wreaked havoc where they were. Their biggest problems were their bulkiness, their kind of stupidity, and despite the fact they ran on tracks, they weren't really exactly an all-terrain vehicle. They were more just tracks for stability. Their armor plating was actually pretty decent, shown to take quite a lot of damage compared to a lot of other things in their size range. Basically, these things punched well above their weight and were still able to take quite a beating, much like many Terminators, but they're not exactly the top of the range, but at their time. Built by the military, constructed to fight human wars, they were state of the art. To get to the next Terminator, we've got to skip ahead into the future war, into what we didn't see until Terminator Salvation was the T-600. The T-600s were described by Kyle Reese. They were kind of stupid, not very convincing. They were hulking, they were large, they were dumb, and the early versions of these, which were built as an infiltrator, they were humanoid in form. They could hold human tools, equipment, weapons, and they could, at least in silhouette, put some clothes on them, and with a bit of rubber skin, at a distance, if you squinted, you could mistake them for human. But they moved rather unnaturally, and with their lack of intelligence and skill, they weren't really able to mimic humans very well. They were easy to spot. You didn't even need a dog to sniff these things out. You could do it with the naked eye. The rubber skin was a dead giveaway. They simply were not good enough to pass for human and close inspection. In terms of abilities, however, yes, they were stupid, but they were physically very, very strong. No match for T-800, but they were strong, very durable, and seemed to, like many Terminators, remain operational even after weathering extensive damage. One of them was seen to not only be hit multiple times or it shot off its own foot, but it kept going. Another one was blown in half before ultimately being destroyed by John Connor. These things could take the beating, but they could also give it. They were nasty killing machines that used to prowl the battlefields searching for any humans to destroy both inside and outside of Skynet-controlled territory. On to the next one, the T-800s. I think we can all agree, freaking awesome. Ever since that first T-800 stepped out of the burning wreckage of the truck that had consumed it in flames, and we saw the metal endoskeleton of the first T-800 sent back in time to kill Sarah Connor, it stays with you, much like the nightmare that originally rose to its creation by James Cameron likely stayed with him. This thing, it haunts you. It's beautiful, and considering it's done with miniatures and practical effects as well in the movie, hell yeah, this film is doing it right. The 1984 classic Terminator saw the first appearance of this classic machine. This was the next evolution of the Terminator. It was considered a cybernetic organism. That's not entirely accurate if you actually really want to break down what a cyborg is. A cyborg, strictly speaking, is a machine and organic creature hybrid, but it can't survive without either component. Now, the only way a Terminator is a cybernetic organism truly is that it has the ability to carry a fleshy outer surface. But as we saw with this Terminator, it doesn't need it to survive. It doesn't need its skin, its organic components. It doesn't need the organic eyes to see. It actually benefits very little, if in any way, from having the organic tissue strapped onto it. I doubt it gives it much strength. It certainly doesn't make it any more bulletproof. It's reasonable that the muscles in the organic flesh suit that it wears work, and maybe it makes it a little bit stronger, marginally, but probably not in a useful way really to the Terminator. It's more used as a camouflage. It's better as a disguise to let it infiltrate human bases. Also, this machine was a massive step up in its intelligence. The armor-plated endoskeleton made it pretty much indestructible to 20th century weapons, although it was vulnerable to the plasma weapons of the future, of course, but it was not easy to take down. Its main strength, though, was this was an advanced learning computer. When sent out on its own, Skynet rigged it to read only. It couldn't do much learning. It could operate on its own or in groups. Skynet would often build these things en masse and have them as everything from a truck driver right the way up through to mainstay combat units, patrolling the battlefield along with the HKs, eradicating humans. Them ones it didn't bother to slap the organic tissue on. Although these were extremely sophisticated machines, they had their flaws. They were large, they were hulking, and they didn't compartmentalize information in the same way as a human. But all that being equal, they were still very cool. Possibly the most iconic cinematic android ever after Data. But obviously much more of a killing machine. The next will be the T-850. The T-850, we're not going to go into too much. We see it in Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines. It's basically the same as the T-800, only it's a little smarter. There's not really much more to say on that. You want to know more about this one? Talk to the hand. Next, the T-1000. I assume the T-1000, as it was the advanced prototype, was built after the T-800 but before the TX. So, the T-1000, portrayed on screen by the legendary Robert Patrick. Its movements, although it was incredibly good at infiltration, it was noted as being kind of animalistic in its approach to a lot of things. It was a animatic polyalloy based machine. You'd have to assume this realistically means it's actually constructed of a form of nanotechnology, an early version of what we would see later. But it was capable of mimicking other objects and people which were of about the same mass as itself, with very little flex in that. It was able to not perform complex machines. It was not to emulate complex machines. It was able to, duplicate knives, stabbing weapons, things like that, but as the T-800 said, it couldn't turn itself into a pack of cigarettes. It couldn't make a gun, because they had moving parts and chemicals that it wasn't capable of doing. But it was capable of anything it had touched, or had enough good working knowledge of. It could simply replicate in terms of physical appearance. It was, however, vulnerable to certain things. You could see this thing take a lot of damage, but it'd get it up again. It'd basically short-circuited if you hit it with enough shells and shotgun fire, but it would get up again. But it was vulnerable to extreme cold or extreme heat. Extreme cold damaged it. When we saw it frozen by liquid nitrogen, it eventually did liquefy again once it reached temperature, but its mimicking abilities and shapeshifting abilities were limited after this, being damaged, often seen to sort of reset itself, sort of shudder, and every time it touched something it would sometimes molecularly bond to it and duplicate metals that it was touching, because it was like it was sampling it and it couldn't stop itself. It became a little less effective, but was ultimately melted in a liquid metal vat. Quite ironic. Not an easy thing to kill, extremely dangerous, far worse than the T-800, and still freaking awesome. Incidentally, in case you're ever passively pondering how they did it, it's kind of cool. The liquid metal, how they got it all to sort of move back together, that's actually mercury. Mercury is a weird metal. It's kind of attracted to itself. They just kind of poured mercury out, and mercury will naturally pull itself back together. That's all it is. Still cool, looks amazing, and because most people don't have much interaction with mercury, because why would you? The stuff's dangerous. It's pretty damn cool. Moving on, the TX. The TX was the Terminator killer. This was Skynet's response to the fact that Connor and the other human rebels kept capturing and reprogramming Terminators. So it was an anti-Terminator Terminator. It typically took on the appearance, at least the one we met, of a human woman. It could vary its appearance, like others though it could shapeshift. Its outward appearance was merely an aesthetic choice, what got it through the door. The T-1000 chose to be a cop because it was a figure of trust and authority. The TX chose a woman because it lowered the guard of certain people. She chose to be an attractive woman so that men, generally at least, a good half of the population, will be generally more at ease with her and less, and just basically more attracted to her rather than threatened by her. It basically allowed her to move around in a bit more of a camouflage state. This particular Terminator though did come with built-in weaponry, including plasma weapons, flamethrowers, and was fairly adaptable. When one was damaged, it was able to alter it into another weapon. As we saw, when the plasma weapon was damaged, it was able to reconfigure the weapon into a flamethrower. It was able to shapeshift, much like the T-1000, but did have a bit more limitation with that. Although it could shapeshift into other people, it couldn't do what we saw the T-1000 do occasionally, kind of pancake itself. It couldn't move through bars or through grating like the T-1000 could, because it still had a metal endoskeleton inside of it. The TX was vulnerable to similar problems to both the T-800 and the T-1000, but it was smarter, faster, and more advanced than any other Terminator model that had ever come before it. And for some reason, which we don't fully understand, both the T-1000 and the TX were capable of traveling through time, even though they were not wrapped in organic living tissue. Which always made me wonder, was there like a fleshy ball of discardable organic matter that they came back in? Like literally like a cocoon of organic tissue that they were wrapped in, sent back in time, and they kind of just shredded it when they got out? Would have been really gross, but that's what I always kind of figured. The T-1000, he literally made himself a ball, and he was inside a sphere of just temporary organic tissue for them to send him back, and then when he got to the 20th century, he just cut his way out of it. And that was the end of it. So was it like behind that cop car or wagon or whatever, was it just this nasty little gross discarded husk of tissue somewhere? Kind of a gross thought. Next we have Marcus Wright, possibly the only example of a true cybernetic organism in this franchise. Marcus was a human born, he was executed and resurrected as a cyborg by Skynet. It basically took his brain and put it into a robot body with artificially grown flesh, most likely on the outside. We know that he had a very powerful heart, but was basically still a Terminator. He was relaying information to Skynet without knowing it. He was a perfect sleeper agent. He could mimic human better than anybody. He was able to get in, emotionally appear more human, He could manipulate people, not even realizing he was doing it, because effectively he wasn't. He did eventually, of course, turn on Skynet. By the way, spoilers if you've not seen Terminator Salvation, or any of these films really. Spoilers for everything. He was, in a way, the perfect infiltrator. The problem was the human element from the Skynet perspective. Because he was human, they'd just been given a robot body, he wasn't buying into the, he wasn't getting the Kool-Aid that Skynet was offering. It was like, no, I may be a robot, I may be a machine now, but I started out as human. Ultimately sacrificing himself, giving his amazingly powerful heart to John Connor, who had actually saved his life. It was his redemption for the bad stuff he'd done that got him put on death row in the first place. Ultimately, as I said, the only true, really cybernetic organism in the entire franchise. And now for some of the more recent Terminator adaptations, we've got the T-5000. The T-5000 was basically Skynet downloaded into a Terminator body. The Terminator body was similar to the T-1000, except this one was made of nanites. It was able to hold the vast consciousness and intelligence that was Skynet. It infiltrated very effectively John Connor's forces, and just as Kyle Reese was being sent back in time, this thing killed everybody there, got its hands on John Connor, and then infected him with nanites, converting him into the T-3000 infiltrator. Based on the numerical system, you'd assume the T-3000 is less sophisticated than the T-5000. But, moving along, because I don't like this film, the T-3000, which was basically by now John Connor, took John Connor's memories and knowledge, but turned it into a Terminator. It was basically made of nanites, and it didn't like magnets. But I really hate this film. I'm sorry, but Terminator Genisys is awful. It is a bad movie. And they destroyed John Connor. They turned John Connor into a goddamn Terminator. A powerful Terminator, yes. The T-3000 maybe objectively, along with the T-5000, the two most powerful incarnations of a Terminator we've ever seen on screen. Far more than even the one in Terminator Dark Fate. But, all the same, it's so stupid. The film is stupid. So we're going to move on. So we're into the home run here. The Rev 9. Now serving Legion, which is basically a substitute Skynet for some reason. The Rev 9 is actually very, very similar to the TX. It's the ultimate in divide and conquer. We see these things used very effectively in the future war. They're deadly. It's highly intelligent, borderline charismatic, and even seems to have a sense of humor, going as far as to apologize to its victims. It's actually very entertaining to watch. I'm not going to lie, I kind of enjoyed Dark Fate. It's nowhere near the caliber of many of the films that came before it, and I actually like Salvation, so I'm probably on my own on that as well. I don't love Dark Fate as a movie, but it's not terrible. It's certainly not Genisys. I think coming off Genisys, I think if Genisys didn't exist, Dark Fate would be my least favorite Terminator movie. But because Genisys exists, that is forever going to be scraping the bottom of the barrel, which is a shame because actually Genisys has a really good cast. But the Rev 9, its breakdown, as I said, it's quite similar to the TX. It has a metal endoskeleton as well as a mimetic polyalloy outer. The difference is they can separate and operate as two distinct Terminators. It gives it many of the same abilities in its separated form, both a T-800 and a T-1000, as well as in a combined form. It has the speed and agility and durability. We've seen the machine take direct hits from rocket launchers. It's going off the side of buildings. It's incredibly durable and sturdy machine. Again, the eeriest thing I think about the Rev 9 is not its physical abilities, but its mental capacity. The fact that this thing kills you, but it kills you with a smile, I think makes it all the more creepy as an adversary, much more so than the sort of humorless T-800, the overly comical T-850. And yeah, the T-1000 had an element of that, like when it was waggling its finger at Sarah Connor for shooting it. But those are chameleon techniques. That one was mimicking human behavior as a part of its infiltration programming. Rev 9 genuinely seemed to be amused at what it was doing, like a psychopath. So, Rev 9, pretty damn badass Terminator. Whether Legion makes any sense, is a different argument, and I'm not really going to get into the movie strengths in this. So, those are, though, all the major Terminators from the movies. I'm not including the Moto Terminators, although those are kind of interesting. I'm classing those as a type of HK. I'm only going with the humanoid Terminators here, and like I said, I'm not doing expanded universe. But final thoughts on this, I'm going to discuss what is my favorite Terminator. I love all the movies, right? My favorite film is probably the original. Made the year I was born, for a start. I don't think it's ever been topped, and I'm going to say that Terminator 2 is probably an equally good and in some ways better movie than the first film. But it's not the first film. Even if it's just as good as the first movie, it's never going to be the first movie. And the first movie that started it all is going to be my favorite forever. That film is magnificent. It's brilliant to watch. It's well paced, put together. The actual favorite Terminator for me is the original T-800. And I'm talking Arnie as the bad guy, something he doesn't get to play very often. And he does it well. The idea of this unstoppable killing machine from the future that means to kill you, specifically you, for things you are never even going to do, really, for something your kid is going to do, just because it wants to basically murder your child, because in its own time none of them have been able to do that, is unspeakably, malevolently evil, and it's delicious. And the film is fucking work of art. But the original T-800, that violent murder machine that killed Bill Paxton, let's not forget this, as well as Brian Thompson, two great actors there, before you even got to anything else. It started the whole thing. The T-800's iconic. You show anyone a picture of that skeletal design. Hell, you show anyone a picture of its foot and they'll probably more or less go, that's the Terminator's foot. Definitely you show it the Terminator skull. People know exactly what that is just at a glance. That's how iconic this one is. And the T-1000's iconic. I mean, the TX was okay, but the T-1000's iconic. The T-800 though, it's the granddaddy of them all, even though it's not the T1. So it gets, for me, a 6 out of 6 for how just awesome and amazing the T-800 really is to this franchise, how irreplaceable it is, which is something they should have learned from making the later movies. With that said, I'm going to bring this to a close. That's my discussion on the Terminators and how great that first one is. If you've enjoyed this, please like, share and subscribe. Check out any other videos in this playlist, as well as other podcasts which I'm currently, I think, as making this one, are just on Star Trek. And thank you for watching or listening. And bye bye.